I'm really delighted to be here today. I was going to come several years ago, before COVID, and I was looking forward to talking about a trilogy, 3 books, which I had written about Franklin Roosevelt as Commander-in-Chief in World War II. The final volume I had just finished, and my publisher asked what I would like to call it, and it covered the very end of FDR's role as Commander-in-Chief and President in 1945 at Yalta and afterwards. And obviously at Yalta, Franklin Roosevelt met with Churchill and the Russians and was trying to plan the peace, the new world order, which is now rapidly disintegrating. But I said I'd like to call it War and Peace. And he said, "Oh, Nigel, you cannot call it that. There is already a book." I said, well, perhaps we could call it On War and Peace. And we tried different permutations of the title, but in the end I said, no, look, let's just call it War and Peace. Well, the book was very well received, and I was very happy with it. And when I next saw my publisher in New York, I said, well, aren't you proud of me? It didn't bomb. Peter Baker gave it a wonderful review, and he's going to Rancho Mirage. And so the publisher said, well, no, we are proud of the book. In fact, they've done a little a box set, which is in the bookstore. And he said, we're very proud of it, Nigel, but there is one problem. When you go on the internet, if you want to buy a copy on Amazon or whatever it is, and you put in War and Peace, you order the book and then you get Tolstoy. So the publisher was complaining because they had to pay money to have an advertisement so that when you go online and you see Tolstoy, you will still see Nigel Hamilton beside Leo Tolstoy. Well, so I was going to talk about Franklin Roosevelt, who I believe is certainly the greatest American president of the 20th century. And but then came COVID, and as you know, the festival was postponed. And in the meantime, postponed again and again. And in the meantime, what do you do as a biographer? Tell me. You write your next book. So I've just completed a new book. I've only just finished the manuscript. It is so fresh and new that when Deborah sent the sort of brochure for the festival, it had a little blurb about Lincoln and Jefferson Davis, which I did not write, and which does not quite cover the subject, but it included a wonderful, pity we don't have it here, a wonderful, but I think you have it in the brochure, a wonderful cartoon of Lincoln and Jefferson Davis as boxers in 1861. The two presidents. Is there? Oh. And I had never seen this cartoon, and I've spent 3 years writing the book. And it's totally authentic. It was done in 1861, and before, I think after Fort Sumter, but at the beginning of the war. And they are, I think I'm going to research it because I'd quite like to put it in the book. It actually has a dialogue between the editor of the New York Tribune at the time, Horace Greeley, and he is saying to Lincoln, "Go in there, man, give it to him." And Lincoln is saying, calm down, Horace, I'll wear him out. As you know, it didn't quite work out like that. I thought I'd start my talk today just by reading the preface that I've written for the book, if you don't mind. Obviously, the editor will cut this horribly, so you'll hear at least the author's version. If the story of Lincoln versus Davis seems positively Shakespearean, it was. The story of two American presidents of the same age, born in the same state, barely 100 miles from one another, and setting forth on the same day by train to their opposing inaugurations, then fighting for 4 years to keep their crowns, with the country's fate at stake, would certainly have intrigued the bard. A story replete with clowns, villains, acolytes, assassination, and great heroines, especially the president's wives, who were women of high intelligence and profound loyalty, yet were destined to suffer grievously, both losing a young son while living in their respective White Houses. Lincoln, the orator and politician, as well as inveterate lawyer, versus Jefferson Davis, born soldier and slave owner, locked in a mortal struggle against each other, literally so in the case of Abraham Lincoln. The historian, however, must parse this drama, and from the drama, the facts, as well as the true course of events, together with their reasons that are not always easy to determine, evaluate, or judge. Enter the biographer, who must elide the two approaches. To the best of my ability, I have tried to do this in Lincoln versus Davis, the War of the Presidents, by putting the reader in the minds of the two adversaries as they faced their unique historical challenge, yet applying enough context too to judge the significance of their actions and decisions at the time and in retrospect. Chief among the latter is the matter of slavery, which, as Lincoln himself admitted later, had been the cause of the war and its curse from the very start, however much he and Davis had done to, quote, shove it under the rug, as the great Civil War historian James McPherson put it. That sad reality, at once so simple and so complicated, undergirded the prosecution of the Civil War for 4 often interfamilial years of mutual slaughter that beset the two opposing sections, North and South, the United States and the Confederate States of America. Without addressing the 4 million slave laborers forced to work for the South, the only means, after all, by which the Confederacy could feed, fuel, and finance its huge armed insurrection against the government, there was no way the politician president, a neophyte in military command, could have won the Civil War, in my estimation, and that of many historians. How Abraham Lincoln came to that military, political, and moral realization, and how Jefferson Davis unwittingly forced him to take his belated decision, one that would ultimately win the war for the Union, is the kernel of my tale. Enjoy. Well, in a year's time, that may be possible. So I thought today, in the time we got together, I would just say something about how I came to write this book about the Civil War. I mean, you would think that as an former Englishman, I probably know a lot more about the English Civil War 200 years earlier than I do about the American Civil War. But the simple reason is that I spent 10 years recounting Franklin Roosevelt's role as Commander-in-Chief in World War II. And after 10 years, I felt I had, sounds pompous to say to grind a lens, but I felt I had developed a certain kind of, not just perspective, but a certain almost photographic lens, let's say, to be able to look at the United States president who, by virtue of the Constitution, has to assume the mantle of commander-in-chief in peace and in war, and how to use that lens to tell the story of how a president faces the challenges of commanding the United States military, the armed forces of the United States, especially in war. How does he do it, especially when he's never been in the military? FDR had never worn uniform, but he had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy in World War I, so he did have some military knowledge. But it is really remarkable, and in some ways it was why my trilogy was so long, to see how he interacted with the professionals, the generals and the admirals and the airmen who were supposed to fight the war on his behalf. Well, having developed that lens, let's call it, I thought I was actually driving from Boston from New Orleans back to Boston, and I, stopped at Gettysburg and went around the battlefield, and I thought, well, first of all, as I said this morning in our panel on biography, the essential element behind all biography is curiosity. I was obviously curious about the battle, and I thought, I wonder whether I could use this lens that I've developed, the Hamilton lens, to look at the man who was the commander-in-chief of the United States Army and Navy in the Civil War at the time of Gettysburg, and who gave this great address after the battle. And I don't know, and then you didn't put on this writers' festival, so what else could I do? So I approached my, I'm joking, but I did approach my publisher or my agent, and I said, I think I'd like to tackle this. And, for my sins, I keep choosing these rather challenging subjects, Montgomery or JFK or, why not write just about ordinary people? But, so the publisher said, oh, that's fine, and we'd love you to do it. And I signed a contract. But as I say, I spent half my life in Boston, half my life in New Orleans. And each time we have a big dog, or had a big dog, each time we would drive down to the south, I would go through these southern states, and I'd see, first of all, lots of rebel flags still flying, and also memorials coming down. Famous memorials in New Orleans, where I live. General Lee and Lee Circle, General Beauregard, beautiful sculpture as you go into the city park, and talk to people about this book, and I realized I was writing the wrong book. That there were already thousands of books about Abraham Lincoln. 16,000 and counting. 16. Yeah. But as far as I knew, nobody had written a major biography of the two presidents, the two competing presidents, the two competing American presidents. And the more I talked about it down in New Orleans, the more people said, well, yeah, of course. And the more I talked about it in Boston, they said, Jefferson who? So I thought, well, this would not only help Nigel to become more educated about the story, but it might even be quite interesting for American readers to learn more about the person who... can we have the cartoon up again? The man whom Lincoln was fighting, Jefferson Phineas Davis, or Phineas. Does anybody know why he was called Phineas? Because he was the last of the brood. They thought he was, last born of the siblings. So, I love this cartoon because it captures that moment when Civil War is just beginning. They're both inaugurated, and they are going to be fighting. And in a way, this is going to be the fight of the century. Two sections of America fighting each other, possibly to the death. Well, the bad news is that the book is long. It's not 3 volumes, don't worry. It's short by my standards, so that is roughly 600 pages. But over a period of time, and Pamela Paul has just been talking about reading and getting your children to read, and so forth. It'd be good for us to spend time with this, because it's an amazing Shakespearean story, and I think to a great extent it has been missed as a story by historians. John Meacham has written this wonderful, his is a very short book. It's only 400 pages. And it covers, those 400 pages cover the whole of Lincoln's life. The bad news, I'm afraid to say, is that my book starts on February the 11th, 1861. on the day when both presidents leave by train to go to their separate inaugurations. One in Washington, 2,000 rather circuitous mile route to Washington, and the other one to Montgomery, the first capital of the Confederacy. And the book ends on September the 22nd, 1862, when Lincoln actually, finally, in my view, very belatedly, issues his he issues his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And in my view, as I've said in the preface, that essentially wins the war for the Union. Because at that moment, there is no way in which the Confederacy will persuade the European powers to intercede or to have anything to do with the Confederacy. And given the huge superiority, economic, industrial, financial, etc., of the North, there was no way in which the Confederacy could then win. And Jefferson Davis knew it. But in that period, from February of 1861 to the fall of 1862, not only are there some huge battles, but there is a huge struggle going on, not only between the two presidents as commanders-in-chief of their various sections, but between the presidents and their own people. Lincoln with the people he called radicals, abolitionists, and Davis with people who believed in states' rights at all costs, to the point where they actually objected to conscription, which would have meant that Davis, as commander-in-chief, would not really basically be able to put an army into the field. Well, the story, I think, was certainly exciting to write. I think we've only got time today for me to cover just a few surprises, which I'm not sure if they will surprise you as much as they surprise me, but I just listed about 6 of them, so let's run through them, and you tell me whether they're necessarily surprising to you. First of all, trains. I think it's pretty extraordinary that these two presidents-elect should set off to their inaugurations by train. As I said, 2,000 miles for Lincoln, 700 miles for Jefferson Davis. But it doesn't stop there. At the battle, some people call it the Battle of Manassas, First Manassas, other people call it the First Battle of Bull Run, about 20 miles from south of Washington. Jefferson Davis, as commander-in-chief, takes the train to the battlefield as it's being fought. When he arrives, Confederate soldiers are streaming away from the battlefield, and he thinks the battle has already been lost. But what people often forget is that whereas Lincoln has almost no military experience at all, he had volunteered during an Indian war, and as he said, he saw more mosquitoes than bullets. He certainly saw no combat. Jefferson Davis was a professional soldier. He had been to West Point. He had fought as a regimental infantry commander in the Mexican War. He had become a war hero As a result, he was more or less awarded a seat in the United States Senate. As a senator, he had then been made Secretary of War for 4 years. Even 1 year as Secretary of the Navy. This was a man, and this is in the 1850s, this was a man who knew quite a lot about war. So in a sense, when I said in the preface, the politician is facing the soldier. And it seemed to me very, very reflective of their talents, that whereas Lincoln was going for a drive from the White House with his wife down to the river, the Potomac, taking his wife for a drive to get some fresh air because he was waiting for telegrams from the battlefield to say how the battle had gone, a battle which he had insisted upon against the advice of his generals. Jefferson Davis, the soldier, is getting on a train and actually going to the battlefield, determined to go onto the battlefield, and if things were going badly, to make sure that they went well. Well, he arrived finally. I think at one point the engine driver or the guard on the train said, "We can't go any further. There's too much firing," and so the last part of the journey, Jefferson Davis went in the locomotive cab. He reaches Manassas, gets out, rides to the headquarters of the army commander there, General Beauregard, asks where the commander is, and they say, "Well, he's moving some troops over there, sir," and then Stonewall Jackson comes up, and President Davis is told, "We have won the battle, thanks to Stonewall Jackson." And sure enough, the battle had been won by trains. Because Jefferson Davis had developed a plan of battle whereby one army would face Lincoln's army as it attacked south of Washington, and Jefferson Davis's other smaller army under General Joe Johnston, which was in the Shenandoah Valley, would take a train secretly as soon as they saw the Union troops coming down south from Washington, would take the train secretly and join Beauregard's troops so that they would be almost even numbers in the battle, which turned in the favor of the Confederates. So this was, if you like, the first of the great battles of history won by trains. And as we know, trains did become the sort of primary transport for the armies for pretty much another, not quite a century, but in the First World War, it was always said that wars were won by trains. Second, villains. If as I think of it, this is such a Shakespearean drama. What play is there in the Bard's canon that doesn't have villains? Now, I wasn't looking for the villains, but they came looking for me. And the first one is William Henry Seward, the Secretary of State appointed by Abraham Lincoln. In my book, I don't know what, I think John Meacham is kinder to the memory of Mr. Seward than I am. I think he was an awful person, and I think he was a traitor. And I have shown in the manuscript how almost as soon I wouldn't say as the war began, because the war only begins with the fall of Fort Sumter in April of 1861, after Lincoln's inauguration. But pretty soon after Lincoln's inauguration, William Seward, the Secretary of State, is so determined that there should not be a war over Fort Sumter that he organizes a cabal of newspaper editors and important people, including the son, I think, of the former president, Charles Adams, who was a congressman, to talk about a coup d'etat, whereby they would get rid of Lincoln as the President of the United States. It didn't eventuate, but Seward then sabotaged Lincoln's attempt to hold on to Fort Sumter. Lincoln arranged for an expedition of naval vessels to go. I only visited Fort Sumter last year, but have many people been there? Yeah. You know, it's in this kind of estuary at Charleston. You can go out on a little boat and see the fort, which still exists. Lincoln decides that he must if he doesn't make a stand there, where will he make a stand? So he sends this secret expedition, and thanks to Seward, the expedition is totally sabotaged. The important battleship, which is meant to go and support the troops as they are ferried to reinforce the fort, is waylaid and sent somewhere else. And Fort Sumter cannot be reinforced and is basically surrendered. So villain number one, Seward. And it goes on. I mean, it doesn't stop there. He goes on trying to stop the Emancipation Proclamation. I do not know why this man's reputation is not that of a treasonous individual in American history. Number two, General George Brinton McClellan. Are we all familiar with Mr. General McClellan? Age 34 when Lincoln makes him. He's a former railway manager. He'd been a captain in the United States Army, an engineer staff officer. He'd been present briefly at the end of the Mexican War, but otherwise knew nothing about battlefield warfare. What does Lincoln do? After Bull Run, the disaster, fiasco of Bull Run in July of 1861, the first great battle of the war, really, Lincoln appoints this 34-year-old twerp in my view, to be not only a general, but within a couple of months, general-in-chief, as they called it. It's now chief of the US Army. So in command of all the United States armies, east and west, at age 34, with virtually no combat experience. I mean, he had been made a major or a colonel briefly for a couple of months and had a small skirmish. That was the extent of his knowledge. But this is my point, and I wish this morning in our panel on biography, I'd been able to talk about one of the delights of being a biographer is to follow the growth. It's not just the story. It's watching an individual grow in office or in terms of life experience. It's what we all, when we look back at our lives, we weigh the good, the bad, and whether we matured. Have we grown? Well, I don't really regret. I am proud to say that the first part of my book is how awful Abraham Lincoln was as commander-in-chief. He keeps making these terrible decisions, and one of them is appointing this 34-year-old twerp. And I wish we had more time, but can I? Oops. If I can find it. Let's go. Yeah, I have it on my iPad. The book is partly a series of set pieces in the Shakespearean manner, and one of them is to do with Lincoln's relationship with this General McClellan, because having appointed him as General-in-Chief, the 34-year-old, he finds the 34-year-old, now head of the United States Army, doesn't want to have anything to do with his commander-in-chief. So when Lincoln goes to see him, he refuses to see him. So I'll just read you, if I may, a little bit of this chapter. It's called Unparalleled Insolence. So I write, General McClellan's incommunicado status was doubly worrying as the young man had promised so much. According to John Hay's diary, that was the president's secretary, of the meeting with McClellan on November the 1st, 1861, McClellan had thanked the president, assuring him he would not be embarrassed by intervention if, as commander-in-chief, the president interceded or disagreed with his manner of command. Just to be sure, however, the president had asked if McClellan was certain that in addition to command of the Army of the Potomac, he could really take on responsibility of the supreme command of the army. The whole US Army, currently swelling to 650,000 men. I can do it all, McClellan had assured the president quietly. That's from the diary. Instead, McClellan had subsequently gone out of his way to show who was now boss in the war, or the conduct of the war. Together with Secretary Seward, John Hay had escorted the president to Army headquarters to see General McClellan on November the 13th, so less than 2 weeks later, only to be told the general was at a wedding reception but would shortly return. Quote from the diary, we went in, and after we had waited about an hour, McClellan, came in and without paying any attention to the porter who told him the president was waiting, went upstairs, passing the room where the president and Secretary of State were seated. They waited about half an hour and sent once more a servant to tell the general that they were there. And the answer coolly came that the general had gone to bed. 34 years old. Well, he was probably tired. Gone to bed without a word to the President of the United States waiting to see him. In his diary, Hay thought it a, quote, dreadful portent of evil to come, end of quote, a prediction that would be proven sadly right. Quote, I merely record this unparalleled insolence of epaulette without comment, Hay penned. It is the first indication I have yet seen of the threatened supremacy of military authorities. And how right he was. The army, often in potential revolt against the president, especially over emancipation. Just very briefly, I know we're running a bit short time, the women. So those are the two villains, Seward and Macmillan in the new book. Heroines, the wives, the four biggest heroines, Mary Lincoln. I think all her brothers, her half-brothers, joined the Confederacy. But she never lost faith in Abraham or the Union. Suffered not only mental problems, but her son died in the course of my book at the White House. And she was never really the same person. How many people know about Verena Davis, Jefferson Davis's wife? One? This has been my experience, and yet to me this is the most fascinating woman of the whole book. She was only 34 years old, but at least she wasn't general-in-chief or supreme commander. She was a wonderful woman who'd met Jefferson Davis's first wife died on their honeymoon. She was the daughter of a man who became president of the United States, Zachary Taylor. But she died on their honeymoon. And Davis was a widower for 10 years. And then he met this young Virginia Howell, whose grandfather came from the North. He was twice governor of New Jersey. She did live in Mississippi with her parents at Natchez, near Vicksburg, but she had probably more relatives in the North than in the South. And she was pretty against secession and did not think her husband was a very good politician. She thought he was a brave soldier, and he would have been much better if because he was appointed, once the Confederacy was established, he was originally appointed as general to command the Army of Mississippi. But then there was a vote taken by representatives of the original states, and he was appointed president-elect, and she didn't think he was really cut out for that. So her letters, her diaries, the diaries of people around her, Mary Chestnut and so forth, are really fascinating. A very smart woman, far more, better probably educated than Jefferson Davis himself, and with a very fierce wit, and but very loyal to her husband through the Civil War, the tragedy of the Civil War. So she's very much one of the four heroines. The third I'd mention is Jesse Fremont. How many people know about General Fremont? More people, good. He is one of the heroes of my book because he issues the first Emancipation Proclamation already in 1861, after Bull Run. Lincoln sends him as a general. He was known as the Pathfinder. He'd helped to secure statehood for California. He was a United States senator, but he was a soldier. He'd been a lieutenant in the United States Army, a map maker and explorer, of course, the Rockies and so forth. And Lincoln made him a general, sends him out to the west, to Missouri, appoints him to command in Missouri and take over a pretty terrible situation there with uprisings and riots and so forth. And General Fremont decides there is only one way to win this war, and that's to stop the South using slave laborers to win the war for them by working for them as slaves. And so he issues a proclamation. This is already in the early fall of 1861, and Lincoln forces him to retract it. Bad thing. So what does John Fremont's wife do? She goes by train to Washington, and she has a set to it. It's another set piece. I'd love to read it, but I think we're running out of time. She has this set to with Abraham Lincoln. Her train arrives in the evening. She goes to the famous Willard's Hotel. She gets a note that the president would like to see her. She goes with a friend, a judge, and she has this fierce argument. Some people, her nickname later was General Jessie. She was a fierce woman. And they have this terrific argument about emancipation. And Lincoln says, basically, no woman has ever talked to me like this before. Thou shalt not speak to me like this. And she pulls out a handkerchief. I don't know if she throws it down, but she basically challenges him to a duel. So she is number 3 heroine. And number 4 heroine is Frances Seward, the wife of William Henry Seward, the Secretary of State, who harbored fugitive slaves on her estate in Auburn in New York, and who deplored her husband's basically slimy appeasement of the South, because she was very rich, he had married her, pretending that he was an abolitionist, he was against slavery and so forth. And when the call came, he would not stand for that principle. So she was pretty disgusted with him. So she's heroine number 4. I think that's all I'm going to have time for. So I may have to, if they invited me, I might have to come back next year and tell you more. And then you wouldn't have to read the book.